introductions. I'm Jeanette Schnars. I'm the Executive Director of the Regional Science Consortium, and thank you for coming out to our 13th Annual Research Symposium. It's hard to believe it's been 13 years already, but we have a lot of great talks and posters that are still up from our poster session last night. So as we have breaks, coffee breaks or lunch breaks, please go out and check out those posters. We also have exhibitor tables throughout the lobby and even back towards this direction here. So definitely check those out as well. There's a lot of good information with organizations that we work with or collaborate with on a lot. And so today is our full day. We have talks all day, and please stay with us for as long as you can and check all of those talks out. It's always good to know what other people are doing and what other research is going on in this region. And so for our morning session, Dr. Bob White will be chairing, and so I'm just going to turn it right over to him. Just real quick, so you guys know, we do have all of our presentations live streamed through our YouTube channel. So if you're a presenter, I think I've already made you aware of that. Or if tomorrow you can't make it to the presentations in the morning, you could always check them out online as they're happening. So everybody on your best behavior. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm not one for the microphone, so hopefully this will be picked up. But I'm not a speaker today either. So I hope you will enjoy the session. As Dr. Schnars, Jeanette said, I hope you'll stick around and enjoy all the presentations today, particularly this afternoon when we have a special HABS presentation. But now we're going to start with our first presentation, and we have a couple of speed talks. And so our first talk is Ann Helms from Mercyhurst. Ann?
Thank you. So, my name is Ann Helms, and I'm a senior at Mercyhurst University, and I want to talk to you today about the prospects for an active biological restoration of Erie's Garrison Run. So where is Garrison Run? It is a small, nearly 2-mile stream running from behind Frontier Lumber on 6th Street to a confluence at the wastewater treatment plant, which joins Mill Creek before spilling out into Presque Bay. So that leg right there is Garrison Run. But you may notice that even though that's pretty much all of the stream, the catchment area is actually all the way back here at Grandview Boulevard, and for you who's not familiar, that's where the old Kmart is on Pine Avenue. So just to familiarize ourselves with Southeast Erie, Garrison Run is in the highly industrialized area and surrounded by over 50% impervious surfaces. So this is the bank where we've done most of our studies. This is the wetlands that are in front of the wastewater treatment plant. These are clean fill wetlands that are not natural. That is behind Frontier Lumber, and that is the bridge at the confluence. So the highly industrialized area Garrison Run is located in has been the most likely reason for the consistently low scoring water quality scores over the past 15 years. As you can see, Garrison Run is consistently scored a 6. And with the latest test done in 2016 being no exception. This was a more rigorous statistical test yielding pretty similar results, and that is in comparison with another non-attaining stream in Harbor Creek, which didn't even reach a good score. So Garrison Run's catchment issues are actually pretty typical for a small stream running through an industrial area, as an influx of toxic or anoxic substances on occasion, a lot of dumping along its upper banks. In its catchment area, this is the oil-filled, oil-soaked ground at the old Wayne Street Railroad Station, and its left bank is pretty unstable. This is all also considered urban clean fill. So all of these issues make it seem like the Garrison Run is an unattractive restoration project. However, not so fast. There's some actual, Garrison Run has actually a lot of possibilities, could make it actually a good candidate for unlimited recovery. It has a stable right bank, healthy bryophyte community, and an active riparian zone. It also has a surprisingly healthy periphyte community, which Dr. Campbell will talk about in the next presentation. It also has plentiful food source with frequent detritus inputs. So, according to studies, the majority of stream restorations produced no tangible results, with some having actually worse quality after restoration. The reason for this high failure rate is, according to a German study, a lack of appropriate local ecological planning. The truth is, most stream projects address big, expensive catchment problems and fail to systematically address the local level. So here's a pretty standard ecological model for addressing stream restoration issues, and you notice these are all interconnected and pretty much depend on each other for success. So we chose to focus on the testing of the feasibility, restoring the diversity and trophic levels, so that would be our food web structures and reestablishing populations. Our hypothesis was simply that if diversity can be partially restored to then a more expensive restoration can be undertaken with some measure of success. So how we chose to test this idea, quickly, this is where Garrison Run at as far as the diversity of taxa. You notice there are 0 EPT taxa in the Garrison Run right now, and the numbers next to the taxa we did find just indicates its tolerance level. And you notice that there's some pretty high tolerance levels. There's also no crane flies. I'm sorry, I forgot to X that out. So what we decided to do was just do a bioassay using a simple design after Bob Wellington. We used a clear plastic sterilite box with locking lids and drilled holes in them around all the sides. That's our box. And we put 14 adult fathead minnows in each box, locked a lid in, and we set them out in 3 locations in the upper reach. And we used a 72-hour time frame, pretty standard for a bioassay, and checked the boxes every 24 hours. We anchored them with rocks also, and tried to hide them as best as possible. Despite that, somebody still stole one of our boxes of fish. Shame on them. Okay. So here are results minus our stolen box of fish. This is a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis graph, and our site A and site C were not too much different than the background, our background die-off rate, which is the yellow line. Background had died at about 10% per day, and ours closely mirrored that survival. So we were pretty encouraged by our fish results, so we decided to test a moderately pollution entombed trichoptera, or net spinning caddisfly, in the stream to see how they survived in situ. So we took 20 caddisflies, 13 hydrocyclidae, and 7 philotopodamnidae from Walnut Creek, the location just behind the casino, or close to casino, and the dissolved oxygen level in that area of the stream is 100%. And we put them in a 500 micron mesh bag with Velcro to seal. To seal the bags, this is our bag design right here. And the Velcro, the idea with the Velcro is for easy access so that we could observe the results. We placed some spoke gravel and rocks into the bags to provide them with natural surroundings, and put them in pretty much the same location as the fish. And the DO level in Garrison Run at that time was 55%. So, here are our preliminary results of that study. And unfortunately, bag design was an issue, and we had a large number. Eventually, I'll get the hang of this. Probably not this presentation. A large number went missing because of the poor bag design, but We also had one that had some pre-escapees before the study even started, so they only had 8 individuals instead of the 20. But the ones that were alive, left in the bags, they were unstressed, they were performing normal biological functions in the bags, including net spinning, and they were also building homes inside or casings inside the bags, and that was a very surprising result. So based upon this encouraging result, we intend to continue doing these studies, and these results indicate there's a high probability that we can possibly, with some limited restoration, restore some of Garrison Run's diversity. With the catch being larger, catchment issues have to be addressed. And that includes runoff, the banks to Garrison Run, the left bank, the soil at the Wayne Street Railroad Station, which undoubtedly overruns in any storm. So, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Questions? Okay, thank you very much, Ann. Okay, for our next speed talk, we have Dr. Michael Campbell from Mercyhurst.
I told my students they weren't allowed to cheer for me, so I hope they don't. I said, this is science, don't cheer for people.
Mike, if you can't figure that out by now,
I have to close this out.
Yeah.
So it wasn't this.
Yeah, Bob didn't even watch your talk.
There it is.
you're not sitting in
Okay. So I'm going to be sharing with you some of the other things we did this summer at Garrison Run, besides Ann's analysis of the capacity of Garrison Run to in fact support more diverse aquatic life than it currently appears to have in it. And on a few of the dates when we were out at Garrison Run this summer, I thought ahead, which is something I don't always do, and we put some artificial substrates out, and we were pleased to see an abundant growth of periphyton on the rocks, even a short distance downstream from where the creek emerges from the culvert behind Frontier Lumber. And just to review briefly, the watershed of Garrison Run is extraordinary because such a small percentage of it actually has the stream exposed. Probably 75 to 80% of the watershed has the headwaters and even major tributaries of Garrison Run completely enclosed within culverts and storm sewers. And as Ann indicated, the watershed begins all the way up near the old Kmart parking lot on Grandview Avenue. The area enclosed by the yellow rectangle is what we'll now advance to look a little bit more closely from satellite. The area right in here is where it first comes out of the culvert behind Frontier Lumber, and there's several hundred meters of the exposed channel then that runs sort of in a southwest direction, and it goes near the Wayne Blockhouse, between the Wayne Blockhouse and the East Side Connector. And then a little bit better close-up of the area where we sampled. The area enclosed in the red rectangle here is the area that we accessed behind Frontier Lumber. And it's pretty easy to get to it. This is what the Google Streets view looks like. You can park right there and ride along the curb and walk along the railroad tracks and hope a train doesn't come. And if you follow the fence line of Frontier Lumber, there's a kind of a path in there through a tangle of Japanese knotweed. There's a lot of invasive plants in that riparian area, but you can get down to the creek. And Angelia Belfiore and Ann were both working with me this summer and helping Ann with her project. And Ann didn't want me to use a picture of her, so I'm just going to move past that real quick. As Ann already said, we've known for decades that the benthic macroinvertebrate community in Garrison Run indicates a degraded condition. We've never seen any taxa, mayflies, stoneflies, or caddisflies, which are the pollution-sensitive ones that we like to see in our freshwater streams, and most of our streams in the area have them. And what we've always found since the late 1990s was huge numbers of oligochaetes, which are including the genus Tubifex, and they live in sewage treatment plants, if that gives you an idea of the quality of the environments that oligochaetes thrive in, and a lot of planarians too, which are also pollution tolerant. So our study of the periphyton, which in all the years I've been going to Garrison Run, I never tried looking to see what was growing on the rocks besides the worms. So we put some artificial substrates out in late May, early June, and then in July went back to recover the artificial substrates when Ann was doing her bioassay study with the fathead minnows, and took some samples of periphyton from the substrates, as well as scraping some directly from the rocks where we could see growth. And we didn't collect this cladophora. We were taking samples of the films of periphyton that were not in large filamentous clumps. And I was honestly amazed at the nice variety of diatoms that were plainly visible in the samples, several different taxa. I did not clean the samples and look at them with oil immersion to identify diatoms to species. That's a skill I've never acquired, but I was able to recognize at least 7 different genera of diatoms. And here's some labeled photos of the Navicula, Nichia, Coconius, Reucosphenia, and others that were easily identified in our samples. And I would suspect that several of these genera might in fact have more than one species represented in the community. Besides the diatoms, there was just very small numbers of cyanobacteria present, which we see in streams, and some evidence of an aquatic fungus, and always what we see in clean streams is an abundance of the brown gunk with bacteria, which represents particulate organic matter. And all of these entities are potential food sources for the invertebrates that typically live in our streams. And the abundance of the diatoms, I would think, is significant because that could represent an important food source for grazing aquatic insects like the mayflies. So I would think that if by some level of effort we could help aquatic insect populations to make their way to Garrison Run, they might in fact be able to survive based upon the first step of the bioassay studies which Ann carried out. I compared the quantitative representation of different types of diatoms in Garrison Run to some work that was done several years ago by another student who was studying trout run periphyton in western Erie County. And it wasn't a bad comparison. There was a high number of the genus Nichia and Navicula, which are considered motile diatoms, and that means that they're able to kind of readjust their positions on the substrates if silt deposits on the stream. And there were pretty high percentages of these motile diatoms in the samples, which is not a surprising indication that, there are silt deposition issues there. The unstable banks, as well as what comes out of the culvert during storm events, results in a lot of silt deposited on the stream. But some of our less sensitive aquatic insects tolerate that quite well. So my conclusion, as with Ann, is despite the apparent chronic abuse of Garrison Run from the numerous sources of pollution in the upstream watershed, I'm encouraged by what we've seen in the periphyton community, that the stream does have a foundation of food sources that would be normally necessary to support aquatic insects in the macroinvertebrate community, besides annelids and flatworms. These critters might just need some help getting there, since the stream is somewhat isolated on the Lower East Side in an urban area, at least a mile or so removed from any other local streams that might have healthy populations of aquatic insects. So who knows, if it was in a different situation closer to a stream that had aquatic insect populations, we might have seen more recovery in this stream, since some of the combined sewer overflow issues were corrected. So a little message of hope for Garrison Run, I hope. Thank you.
Questions? No questions? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker is Kurt Moeller from SUNY Fredonia. Kurt here? Kurt? And let's see if we can find your presentation. And Kurt, you're a student at...
Yes, a senior undergraduate.
Kurt is an undergraduate senior at Fredonia.
All right, good morning, everybody. So this summer, I got to spend a lot of time in the forest. Spent a lot of time hugging big trees that were covered in poison ivy, and trying to keep my boots on as I squelched through the mud. And what I was doing was working with Dr. Titus, who's been doing a long-term study on forest changes due to a number of drivers of succession, both natural, climate change, deer populations, as well as a number of invasive insects and diseases that are really, that seem to really be driving some very rapid changes. So I kind of thought this picture was a great way to represent forest change. At one point, there was a rather large tree there that died, and there was a stump, and this yellow birch took root there, and the stump has long since rotted. So, all right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about the three main drivers that we're seeing of change, and as that ended up working out, they're kind of in order from one that's already caused a lot of change to one that's causing a lot of change right now, to one that we expect is going to cause a lot of change. So the first is beech bark disease. Beech trees are super important in the forest. They're a climax species, and the nuts they produce are documented to be a mainstay food source for at least 40 different species. So this disease first appeared in Nova Scotia around 1920, and it spread south and west from there. And what the disease actually is, it's a combination of a non-native scale insect and several different funguses, some of which are native and some of which are not. And the insect basically puts little holes in the bark, and so the fungus can get in there. And it causes lesions in the bark. And eventually, once you get enough lesions, it'll girdle the tree, and the tree will die. But this can take a very long time. So there's an example of a healthy tree, and there's one that's been covered in lesions and dead. So another driver that we're seeing right now is emerald ash borer. This is happening right now. So green ashes are very important. It's another climax species. Let's see. There was a recent study that listed 43 different native insect species as being reliant on ash for food and breeding. So they're super important, and they're especially important in lowland areas because green ash and black ash tend to be kind of the trees that do well in swampy areas where a lot of other trees won't do. So we're already seeing ashes dying very quickly, and we had a little glimmer of hope a minute ago, so here's a little pessimism. Andrew Liebeck is an entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service, and he expects that 99% of the ash in North America are going to die. So what we're doing is we're looking at how is the forest going to change when all the ash are gone. A little bit about the emerald ash borer. It was introduced from Asia. They think by shipping crates, probably in the auto industry, since it's first showed up in Detroit. It was first founded in 2002. It's here in New York, or Pennsylvania. In New York is where I was working. And it'll kill trees pretty quick, in like 2 years. And then the final driver that we're really looking at is hemlock woolly adelgid, which is just starting to appear. Hemlocks are super important. They're a climax species, and the ecosystems where they are, hemlock forest is a hemlock forest because of hemlocks. So when they're gone, it's totally going to change the ecosystem. There's 5 native populations of the hemlock woolly adelgid, 2 in China, 2 in Japan, and there's actually a native one in the Pacific Northwest. The population that we're seeing here now is from China, and they think it was introduced by a nursery stock in the 1940s. It was first reported in the eastern United States in 1951. So this one's kind of scary. I like hemlocks a lot. So this entered the Great Smoky Mountains in 2000, and by 2012, all of the hemlocks were gone that were not treated. So this is kind of on its way here. There's some controls. I talk a little bit more about this one because I like hemlocks a lot. So you can stem inject with a middle clipper, which works. It's been used locally in my area. It was used in Zor Valley. And there's also some promising biologic controls. This Laricobrius nigrinus, which is a beetle from the Northwest, seems to be fairly effective. And there's even some native silverflies that they're looking at that seem to be kind of effective in combating it. So in our own woodlot on the SUNY Fredonia campus, we found hemlock woolly adelgid. It's been there for a number of years. So in the spring, Dr. Titus and several students will go out and mark the trees, and then facilities will follow up. They'll do basal stem injections of the middle clipper. So hopefully that will be enough. This summer we put a new plot right in the center of one of the hemlock groves. So there's a baseline should all the hemlocks change. All right, so now we'll get into what we actually did. So there's 32 900 square meter plots. They're located throughout Chautauqua County. That's the red one in case you didn't know on the map of New York there. And they're in a variety of different ecosystems. So there's upland plots and there's lowland swamps. There's like hardwoods. There's one plot that's actually like a plantation, tamarack pine from probably the 30s. So there's a lot of different stages of forest that we're looking at. And in each plot, what we would do is we'd go in and all the trees are marked and we'd measure DBH, diameter crest height of all the trees. We also looked at canopy cover. We had a little thing where we just look up and see how much sunlight is actually getting to the forest floor. We noted the presence or absence of poison ivy and Virginia creeper on all of the stems, overall tree health, especially in the case of beech bark disease or the emerald ash borer. And in each one of these plots, we also had 3 smaller 16 square meter plots. And in each of these plots, we would mark it out, and they're the same plot from year to year. And we would just count and document and identify all the herbaceous species that were found in the plot. And we would look at also the stems, and so we could get an idea of tree regeneration. In the context of the larger plots, we also looked at what we call down woody debris. So these are falling logs and snags. They had to be at least 10 centimeters in diameter and 50 centimeters long for us to count them, otherwise we ignored it. And because we're also looking at deer populations, we had 2 pre-existing deer exclosures, so that's have a picture of one right there. And we built a third one, and it just keeps the deer out. So you can see what will grow if the deer aren't overgrazing it. So this is an understory plot. A lot going on there, a lot of different plants, so we were literally like counting all the plants in there. All right, so we'll actually start looking at some of the data that we got. So in the College Lodge plots, beech bark disease was a huge driver of change. It's pretty much affected most of the trees in the plots. So what this graph here is showing is it's showing the diameter of the trees and then the how much disease the trees were showing. So you can see that the one labeled intense here is the large diameter trees. So you can kind of look at that and say that all the older trees, the larger trees, they seem to be pretty much impacted by the beech bark disease, and some of the younger trees, the smaller trees, are a little less impacted. So does this mean that they're resistant somehow, or are they just not manifesting the disease yet? That'll come to be shown. These are some of the lowland plots that we looked at. So by lowland, I basically mean a swamp. And what you're really looking at here is you can see that green ash and black ash are the predominant species in these areas. So if the green ash and the black ash are all dying, what else is going to be left in there? This one here is total basal area, and that's just a fancy way of saying how much area does the tree actually take up on the ground. And so when you look at, let's say, Bentley Swamp here, you can see that the area that's taken up is predominantly the larger trees. So there's more large big trees than there is small trees. And those large big trees tend to be the ash. So this graph here, I think, basically was the kind of the most revealing thing that we could see this summer. This is the canopy cover in the lowlands and the swampy areas, and you can see a 20% drop in canopy cover. So the ash trees are dying, and they're dying very fast. That's only 5 years there. Okay, so this here, if you remember the picture of the understory plot, and you look at that and you think, how can you get any data from that? Which is what I said to myself too. So this is called a detrended correspondence analysis. And this over here is data from one of our plots. And this over here is actually data from Mount St. Helens after the eruption. And the point that I put this up here so you could see there is a trend here. You can see as the plots, they move further and further and further and further apart. And basically the further apart the points are, the more different the plots are. And in our plots, you can see that they kind of stay around. They kind of almost sort of circle, meander around. So you're just seeing just changes due to year, changes in precipitation, what plants bloom, what plants not. So what we would hope to see if there is an actual trend as the forest canopy opens up is at some point this plot should end up looking a lot more like this as an actual trend develops. So along the way, had lots of fun in the woods. This little guy here didn't mind while I was measuring the trees around him, and this little baby squirrel, he was in love with me. He was crawling up my pant leg and all sorts of things. So, I also had a chance to see some really cool plants that not everyone gets to see, and working with a botanist certainly helps with that. So this is a spotted wintergreen. Apparently you only find that in pretty old forests, so you won't just see that growing just anywhere. And this is called a rattlesnake fern, where with a group of botanists that day, they were pretty excited about seeing that. I just want to thank Dr. Titus, who never got tired of me asking, what is that? And Priscilla Titus, and Samantha Fleming, who helped me, and everyone else at Sumter Fredonia. Any questions?
Questions?
Yes.
Kurt, was there any portion of your plots where there could have been some timber management or harvesting taking place? And if so, do you think that could interact in affecting the harmful influence of the invasive insects and the disease?
All of the lots that we were looking at, there is no timber management as of now. A lot of them are on preserves that are owned by different nature conservancies and stuff. So I can't really answer to that from what I did this summer. I would go out on a limb and say that anytime you go into a forest and cut down trees or cause any other impact, you're opening it up for invasives. So I think that's about as best as I can answer that.
Thank you.
Other questions? I have a question. So you talked about assessing the tree health?
Yes.
What was the process that you did? Was it subjective? Was it?
It was kind of an arbitrary process. We had like a number scale for the beech bark. So like 1 being no impact up to I think it was 3 was very impacted. When we looked at the ash trees, that was kind of an arbitrary, so we'd say like healthy, declining, or dead, basically. So there was definitely some arbitrariness to it, and I felt like with the ash trees, I was probably another species of trees. If I looked at it in that condition, I might say it was not doing so well. But in the case of the ash, it was like, well, this tree's doing pretty good compared to the rest of the ash trees. So those scales were pretty arbitrary.
So it was more within the species or genus as opposed to
we were definitely looking at tree health of specific species. Okay. So like the maple trees, you wouldn't really notice unless there was something dramatic about a specific tree. But really, we were just looking at the beech and the ash.
The indulgence, is there any kind of predation happening on them?
On them? There is the silver flies. There's a couple native species that I showed there that do predate on them. There's not, the indulgers actually have kind of a funny life cycle, and they don't really become active until October. So a lot of the other stuff is going dormant for the season, and that's when they come out. So there's not a whole lot of other things to predate on them.
So when are they being treated with the metaclopride?
In the spring, yes.
Is there anybody looking to see if anything's going up the food chain?
They did, this is definitely where this gets controversial, they did look at, because they used metaclopride in the Smoky Mountains, and they did a lot of studies on it there, and those studies showed it to be effective and safe. I'm sure you can still find people that would argue otherwise. But you're injecting it into the tree, so it's not, you're not just spraying it. So as best as I could say, the only way that an insect's actually going to get it is to actually get it out of the tree, as opposed to if you were spraying the tree, then it would be residue that would end up in the streams and everything else.
Are climate change phenomena in any way related to any of the 3 things that you mentioned here?
I would definitely say for hemlock woolly adelgid, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying for the other 2. But a really cold winter will kill them off. We don't seem to have really cold winters like we used to. So they're definitely relating the movement of the hemlock woolly adelgid, and it's moving north from south. So there definitely is a correlation with that in the warmer climates.
I think we had them in Erie County for the first recorded time this year. How long ago were they detected up where you are?
Let's see. When were they first?
January 2015.
2015?
Okay.
We saw them first.
And the hemlock woolly adelgid is, it's just starting to appear. So if we can find it, and actually there's a chance to do something about it, as opposed to like the emerald ash borer, it's here, the ash trees they're out basically, and beech bark is obviously that's been here for 40, 50, 60 years. So hemlock woolly adelgid, we're just starting to find these small little outbreaks, so if people find it and see it, we can treat it and do something about it, and maybe not lose another tree species.
When you say it's just up here, but not, so go down to southwest PA, it's been there a long time.
Right.
So it just depends on the area.
It depends on where, yes. Yeah, so I'm speaking from western New York.
So just go down to Pittsburgh and it's had a...
Yeah, it's been in Cook's Forest. I know they've been treating their tree because they have the really big hemlocks there. So they went in and they picked out the biggest ones to treat, and they figured they'll lose the rest of them.
Other questions? We still have a couple of minutes left. Please ask questions.
I've got one more. I must be stupid. I have a lot of questions. How do you recognize the effects of the beach bark disease on a beach?
Beach bark disease, you'll start seeing, when it first starts, you start seeing kind of like a powdery mildew on the bark, and then you'll start seeing black lesions, and you really can't escape when it's starting. The lesions just keep growing and growing, and I mean, I can show you the picture again if I can get back to it. There we go.
Oh.
So I mean, yeah, you really, now this is obviously really
It does
advanced
look
and it's
sick,
got,
yeah.
but yeah, you can't really miss it. Once you see it, you know it's there.
That's a small tree. It doesn't look like a big. So is it headed fairly young? Doesn't look like a big tree. Please
And
do.
I didn't take this picture, so I can't account for how big it is. It does look small. I mean, we see it on small trees there. And some of the other people call it, there's another name for the disease, is beach snap disease, because it'll start dropping branches and chunks of it will just start falling off.
Yeah, I see beech trees all the time in the woods, but I kind of missed that.
Well, and that's actually interesting, and I didn't talk about that. There seems to be populations of beech trees that aren't affected. We have the College Lodge where almost all the beeches are affected, and then on our campus woodlot, there doesn't seem to be any beech bark disease. So even in Fredonia, there's beech trees all over, and none of them seem to have beech bark disease. So the question is it just not getting there somehow, or are these trees resistant? And that's kind of where the fact that some of the funguses that in part cause this disease are native, so it's very well possible that some of the trees could have an inherent ability to resist it.
Thank you, Kurt. Okay, our next speaker is Ashley Abrams, also a student from Fredonia. So what are you trying to do? Get rid of this? Oh, you want to get rid of these? You want to? I have no idea. How does she log in? Oh, she wants to get rid of the screen. I got it. Mike, if you want to keep asking questions, go ahead.
Now's your chance.
I did have another question. We get these weird looking jittery white bugs on beech trees around here. I don't know what those are. Maybe like woolly aphids? Do you see any of those?
Those are Nancy aphids too.
Yeah, they're really crazy looking. Yeah, I've seen them. I've got a video on my cell phone when I took a couple weeks ago. Do they have any harmful effects on the beech trees?
No, no.
They're just not, there can be a lot of different things too, yeah, not just beach.
I've always supported Regional Science Consortium, so I wouldn't miss it for the world. I'd also like to recognize my co-authors and co-investigators on this, Dr. Alan Grafe and Dr. Andrew Mallon from Penn State. They couldn't be here today. And I'd also like to recognize the funding agency here, Pennsylvania Sea Grant. So today we'll be talking a little bit about assessing the economic impact of the recreational fishing industry here within the Pennsylvania section of Lake Erie. So just a brief overview. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the outdoor recreation economy from a national level, and then rein it into what's going on in terms of research and economic research here with the fishery in Pennsylvania. And then we'll look at a little bit of the study background and methods, and respondent profile, talking about who these individuals are. And then I'll give you sort of the meat of the presentation will be top line economic results, and then we'll conclude with some summary and conclusions. So, the outdoor recreation economy, I just want to speak for a moment to the breadth and sheer size and volume of this industry. If you're not familiar, a lot of this information is taken from the Outdoor Industry Report. If you've never seen the Outdoor Industry Report, I would encourage you to look at it. Very interesting results and report. It comes out on an annual basis. So based on the 2017 report, the outdoor recreation industry, consumers spend annually $887 billion. It provides about 7.5 million American jobs, and we're talking about roughly $65 million in federal tax revenue and about $60 billion in state and local tax revenue. So a large, large industry. This is a really telling bar chart here on the left. On the right here, and basically what you're seeing is the outdoor recreation industry in comparison to other industries. So right below the outdoor industry, we see pharmaceuticals, motor vehicles, just showing you the sheer size. It is really right underneath the three largest sectors of the U.S. economy, which would be healthcare and finance. So a big, big time industry. Consumer spending, I've already mentioned, about $887 billion. So where does this number come from? Well, this is broken up into two primary categories. So the first of which is outdoor recreation products, accounting for about $184 billion. So these are things like gear, apparel, equipment, services. I think of REI and things of this nature. But the large chunk of this is coming from trip and travel expenditures, $700 billion roughly. So this includes things like fuel, restaurants and bars, entertainment, groceries, permits, gasoline for boats, things of this nature. And this is the bulk of the spending, and this is what we'll focus on for this type of research. So also in comparison, I just wanted to elaborate a bit on the fact that this industry provides about 7.5 million American jobs dependent upon outdoor recreation. So these are jobs ranging the entire recreation professional spectrum, from hydrologists to fishing guides to sales associates, and so on and so forth. And I found this rather interesting, being a Pennsylvania native myself, and have done a lot of research with extractive industries. More American jobs are directly employed by hunting and fishing, about 500,000 jobs, than the oil and gas extraction industry, with about 180,000 jobs. So just to put things into perspective. So that's what's been done on the national level, and that's what we're looking at in terms of the sheer volume and size of this industry. What has been done to look into this impact in Pennsylvania with the angling industry? So just a really quick literature review, I promise. In 1996, Penn State conducted a study assessing the economic benefits of recreational angling in the entire state of Pennsylvania. And what they found was that the annual economic value was about $4 billion, and the annual economic impact accounted for about $5 billion. In 2003, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat conducted a study that a lot of people in this room are probably familiar with. This was Chuck Fields, and essentially what we looked at, and what they looked at, was the economic impact of recreational fishing on Lake Erie, with an emphasis on steelhead. And so what they found was that anglers spent an estimated $9.5 million in trip-related expenses, and this generated almost $6 million in value-added activity, supporting roughly 220 jobs. So in 2005, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission and Penn State collaborated on a study looking at the economic value of trout streams in Pennsylvania. So just trout streams. Some interesting findings here. PA trout, the trout streams and the trout season contributed $65 million, if not more, to the state's economy within the first 8 weeks of the season. So within the first 2 months of the season. Significant impacts. And then in 2011 was the most recent iteration of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife. This is a survey conducted every 5 years, and we were able to tease out the Pennsylvania data. And according to their data, Pennsylvania angling related expenditures total about $485 million. So we have the well-established recreational fishing industry here in Pennsylvania, this Pennsylvania Lake Erie section. And as many people know in this room, it has a lot of inherent value to us, a lot of intrinsic value. We all know that it's a valuable resource. And it's also the lifeblood and becoming a really prominent industry here in Erie, outpacing some of the historic industries of manufacturing and so on and so forth. But little information exists on the current status and just our section of Lake Erie and our economic impact. So some of these previous assessments are dated or are different scales, so trout or steelhead or the entire state. So this study is a current and comprehensive assessment of the Pennsylvania section, roughly 70-mile section of Lake Erie. So for this research, it was 3 phases of mixed methods research. First phase was a paper and online mail survey. So we worked with Pennsylvania Fish and Boat and obtained access to their database of Lake Erie permit holders, roughly 125,000 individuals. We then randomly selected 5,000 individuals from that database, Lake Erie permit holders, and sent them surveys, mail surveys in 2-week intervals, and you would receive a packet that would allow you to take the survey, a handwritten survey, and mail it back in, or take it online. And this was sent to these individuals 4 times. We received an N of roughly 900 individuals responded and successfully completed this survey for a 24% response rate, which is really good for mail-back and online surveys. In the day and age of we're almost desensitized to this type of thing, 24% is actually quite, is great. So for phase 2, to corroborate this data, we collected on-site data, 4 seasons worth of on-site data, resulting in 516 completed surveys for an 89% response rate. And phase 3 of this study was key informant interviews with some individuals I actually see in this room. We talked to 10 stakeholders, conducted roughly 2-hour interviews with bait shop owners, anglers, industry experts, and so on and so forth. So for this presentation, this is just going to be some top-line data. I'm going to show you, we're going to focus on phase 1 here, the paper and online mailback survey. And just to be clear, this is data asking anglers about their various expenditures over the 2016 season, so over the entire season. So who were these respondents? Well, about half the respondents were shoreline anglers, 35% were private boat anglers, 11% pier anglers, and about 6% charter boat anglers. So when we look at the respondent profile of these individuals, we see educated white males, income ranges, the majority of the sample income range between 25 and 75,000, and the average age was about 50 years old. And when we look at residency, we see that the bulk of our sample, not surprisingly, comes from Pennsylvania, about 90% of the sample, 5% from Ohio, 2.5% from West Virginia, and then we had some other random individuals as well, a few Canadians, and even a Russian gentleman in our sample who bought a Lake Erie permit. Okay, good fishing. So in terms of counties, Erie County represented the largest county, 20%, followed by Allegheny County at 16%, and then Washington County. So if you're not familiar, Allegheny and Washington County essentially encompassing Pittsburgh, so we see a large Pittsburgh constituency coming up and fishing Lake Erie. And the average distance traveled from home was about 100 miles, and 22% of the sample were within 30 miles. So you know, a bulk of the core Erie constituency was also represented in this sample. So a little bit more about these respondents. The primary species targeted were steelhead, followed by walleye, bass, and perch, and then other various species as well. And we like to look at something to sort of flesh out the profile. We call this experience use history. How long have you been using the resource? How familiar are you with the resource? So average days fishing on the Pennsylvania Lake Erie waters in 2016 were about 8 days. Average days fishing non-PA Lake Erie waters were about 13 days, so any other bodies of water. And the total number of years fishing the Pennsylvania Lake Erie waters, 18 years, and the total number of years fishing, 33 years. So all these numbers combined start to show us a profile of a relatively experienced sample. We also ask these individuals about their specialization and their skill. And specialization is essentially how immersed you are in said activity. So we found that the majority of individuals felt that they were moderately specialized and they were advanced. They weren't expert, but advanced. So we have two things here, a moderately specialized and skillful sample and a relatively modest sample as well. And in terms of overall satisfaction, we looked at this on a scale from 1 to 5. We saw a mean of about 3.4. So a relatively satisfied sample, and about 50% of these individuals were satisfied or very satisfied. So getting into the meat of the numbers here. And I want to give a caveat here. This is all top-line preliminary data. There's going to be, I'm going to talk about the steps moving forward here. So take this all with a grain of salt at the moment. This is just beginning the analysis phase. So what we're looking at here is the average amount spent among visitors spending something in each category. So said another way, if we had these three individuals right here who were anglers, and you spent $10, you spent $0, and you spent $10, we're only assessing for this slide right here, these individuals who spent money. We're not including the zeros here. So these are our higher mean values. For the people who spent something, what did they spend? And this is broken down into three categories. So we see Erie County expenditures, any other county in Pennsylvania expenditures, and outside of Pennsylvania. And then various categories of expense. So they are listed from the highest expenses or the greatest amount of expenditures to the lowest amount. And what we're seeing here is that lodging, automobile gas and oil, equipment, groceries, restaurants and bars, boat gas and oil. These are our largest expenses. There are a few outliers and things like this, like I see camping right here, on average about $190, but largely these are our largest categories. And as you would assume, the majority of this is happening in Erie County, and then slightly lower amounts in any other county in PA, and then outside of Pennsylvania, less. Now we can't total these amounts because these only account for the individuals who spent something, but I think a more telling graphic here is our next slide. So this is the average amount spent among all visitors. Said another way, these three gentlemen right here, if you spent 10, you spent nothing, and you spent 10, now we're averaging everyone together, accounting for people who didn't spend anything and people who spent a lot. So our largest categories for expenditure, once again, automobile, gas, and oil, always a top expenditure. Groceries, restaurants, bars, lodging, equipment, and boat gas and oil are our largest expenditure categories. And once again, we see our highest expenditures and our highest averages in Erie County, and then followed by other counties and outside of Pennsylvania. We can total these, and these totals are relatively telling. So we're seeing that $488.65 on average is what a Lake Erie angler from the 2016 season is spending in Erie County. We see the same number, about $122 for any other county in Pennsylvania, and outside of Pennsylvania, about $60. So what does this all mean? This means that on average, Pennsylvania anglers are spending in the Pennsylvania section of Lake Erie $700 or more over the year. And we can make some inferences from that. Once again, this is top line data, but we're talking about $700 per angler, and there are about 125,000 anglers within this representative of Lake Erie permit holders. So I didn't want to jump to any conclusions here, but just wanted to show you that we have some significant economic impacts. So So in summary, accurate and updated economic data is really critical to the health of the natural resource and to the health of the community and the Commonwealth. The fact of the matter is that when we all know that this is an inherently beneficial and wonderful resource, but when we need to pitch it and get backing from our politicians and whatnot, the almighty dollar says volumes and speaks volumes. So now we're able to quantify the value of this resource. And study findings demonstrate that angling within the Pennsylvania portion has significant economic contributions to Erie County, the state, and the region. And so moving forward, once again, this is just top line data. Moving forward, the real meat of this analysis is going to be using in-plan economic analysis tools, and this is modeling techniques, and we'll be able to show the trickle down, the impact of the entire sector on Erie, how many jobs it provides, how much tax revenue it provides for Erie County, for the state, and for the region. So we can understand the size, impact, and value of this entire sector. So I want to thank you for your time. Once again, my name is Mike Ferguson, and I appreciate it, and I'll open it up for any questions that folks might have. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hey, Mike.
How are you?
Good. When do you think you'll have the final report done?
I don't want to pin myself in here, but I'll be talking with Sean probably Jan 31. That's, I think, our contractual agreement with that. So roughly next year, early next year.
Would you come back and give another presentation?
I would love to. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Any insights on the 50% of the surveyed people that were less than satisfied, or what they were unhappy about?
So what we find is, and that's an excellent observation. So what we find from my experience, especially with angling research, is that anglers are sometimes a little more critical of the resource and resource management. And compounding this effect is that we have a very experienced sample. So the rec literature tells us that the more specialized and experienced you are, the more critical you are, and the less likely you are to be satisfied. So if I was a betting man, that's where I would put my money.
Thank you. So what does your mean age of angler tell you about the future of the use of the resource? How does the distribution of that mean work? Is there a youth that's coming up in the sports, or in the outdoorsmanship, or is it really kind of the bulge is on the far right and it's moving further right?
Right. So two things with that. Comparatively, the mean age, we could also look at median age as well, sometimes more telling. But comparatively, the mean age for this sample was a little bit lower than what I've seen with angling studies in the past. Usually we have an older group around their 60s, mid-60s. So being 50, I would say a little bit younger. And I think that has to do with some of the charter boats and various other things, but I know on some of the charter boats, just from my anecdotal observations, had some younger crowds. I distinctly remember surveying a bachelor party getting off one of the charter boats. Also, I think one of the big issues that you might be getting at, right, is there's a major concern that we're not seeing youth involvement and engagement in what we would call consumptive recreation, so hunting and fishing. So I don't want to, suggest what this data is showing, but I think that we do have a bit younger of a sample, and it's quite representative and interesting, to say the least.
How does that $700 amount per angler per year, how does that compare to other locations or states? Is that like a typical number? Is there any sense of that?
So once again, being top line, I haven't compared it just yet. We need to really extrapolate this to its fullest extent. So I don't really know just yet. I don't want to.
If they're estimating other places, if this is typical for Great Lakes, or if this is, you see, I'm sure it varies depending on the resource that you're talking about.
Right.
Just curious if this is sort of a typical number, or?
It's hard to compare just because our, as many of you know, our relatively small section of Lake Erie is unique. So to compare this study to Ohio with a massive portion, would be difficult, and compounding that, I need to run the in-plan analysis to see the full extent for comparison purposes.
Mike, what was the amount of anglers you figured coming to your study? How many anglers were you looking at?
So in this, how many were sampled?
Yeah, well, no, how many do you expect?
fishing in Erie?
Well, I can't give you a number on that. You mean how many individuals I feel from this research are fishing this section? I can't give you really that number. I know there are 125,000 roughly that hold Lake Erie permits.
Okay.
And we pulled 5,000 from that. But I cannot give you an accurate number on how many exactly are fishing this section.
One more question. Do we have a question in the back?
I work for Visit Erie.
Hi.
I'm delighted this is happening because we promote tourism, Erie tourism outside of Erie County.
Sure.
So I'd like to hit on the distribution list, and maybe if I could chat with you afterwards to provide us with some really current information so that we can justify our efforts in promoting fishing as one of the components that we include in our overall marketing plan.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would welcome that conversation and like to talk to you. And just so everybody knows too, all of these reports and this report is listed on Sea Grant's webpage. So these have all become public information when they're released. So that'll be sometime early in 2018.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we're going to give Ashley Brontes another chance here, but it was our fault, so we apologize.
It's going to be so much better than the pictures, I
We need
promise.
to, let's get this out of here. I think everyone should learn to do their talk without the PowerPoint anyway, so.
I could do it, but you're not going to like it.
I need a chalkboard.
Chalkboard, yes. There we go. I like it better.
See, pictures are going to make the difference. All right, I'm going to take you out of Western New York and Western Pennsylvania for a minute and talk about my thesis research that I conducted in Indonesia this summer. So I'm going to start by walking you through some of the geography so you know where I actually spent a very sweaty portion of my summer. Some of the background that hopefully will illuminate how I actually came to form the question that I was asking, the methods in actually performing the bird survey, some of the results, and hopefully some takeaways from what I gathered. So we're in Southeast Asia right now. You see in the inset, you're looking at Australia in the lower right-hand corner, Malaysia in the upper right-hand corner, and in your little box you have the island of Bali. To the left you have Java, and on the right you have Lombok, and you can see that they're all in very close proximity to one another. Where I actually hung out this summer is this little subset, these three islands, and they are Nusa Penida is the largest, Nusa Senengan to the left, and Nusa Lembongan. And that blue line in your inset is also the equator, so we're about 8 degrees south of that. That's going to dictate the fact that we have like a 12-hour day, about approximately 80 to 85 degree temperature year-round, and fluctuating wet and dry seasons. My study was performed in May, which is right in between the wet and dry seasons, so your average precipitation was around 120 millimeters for that time period. So that doesn't really give you a lot of perspective, but this is a map of Chautauqua County. Nusa Penida is about 6.5 miles wide at its widest point, with a peak elevation of a little over 520 meters. So you can see that these three islands, the whole archipelago, comfortably fits inside Chautauqua County several times over. Now, these are separate islands, but they are considered they're governed by Bali. And there's actually part of the Klungkung Regency is still on mainland Bali. But this island, there's that stretch of water that's in between them called the Badung Strait. And it's an extremely turbulent chunk of water because it's not very deep and the landmass is in between. So hundreds of years ago, it was used as a prison, the same way that Alcatraz was. If you're shipped out there without the help of a speedboat with 4 massive motors, you're stuck there. So once they had the prisoners out there, they used them to exploit the island. This is a small island, about 202 kilometers squared. So they were taking them, they were wiping out the trees to ship back to mainland Bali, and they were also excavating limestone They use that a lot for the temples and the palaces that you see throughout the Hindu region that is Greater Bali. So the most recent full-scale survey I found was done by the Dutch in 1924, and they estimated that 86% of the island had been deforested, and that 14% that remained of that primary forest is largely at the absolute highest elevation in the island, and then small chunks of land that are directly around some of these Hindu temples because the land around it is as sacred as the building itself. So where does that leave us on the mainland? Not a lot. But Bali is in the Coral Triangle, so the marine life actually brings in an inordinate number of people to both Bali and the Penida Islands. Those are largely day trips though. They bring them in, drop them off, and then leave. Then all of a sudden in 2004, I had read about the creation of this unofficial Bali Bird Reserve. By unofficial, I mean it's not government sanctioned. It was created by 2 NGOs working together, and they got the cooperation of all 40+ villages on the island. But why? Because of this guy, Leucopsar rothschildi. It's the Bali myna, the Bali starling, the white myna. It has a lot of names in English, but in Bahasa it's just jalak bagi. And you say that anywhere on the island and everybody will know exactly what you're talking about. It's been on the IUCN Red List since 1994. Populations of the bird have decreased. They were documented as low as 5 that were known in the wild. But thanks to some captive breeding by the NGOs and then re-release onto Nusa Penida, they had documented that the populations had gone into the 100-200 range, which is really exceptional in a relatively short period of time. So I looked at this and I said, wow, this is fantastic. How often do you see that, that you have a nature reserve created without all this government sanctioning and funding, but I couldn't find any information on it beyond, oh, we're just doing this. So I said, I wanted to go in there and look at an area in a developing nation and say, how are these birds doing? And the way that I did that was by looking at the different land uses on the islands. So I broke that into 4 different categories that I found that were the most broad and prevalent across the island. Because the island was nearly completely deforested and there is a decent slope, decent elevation changes for such a small place, a lot of the island is terraced. So a lot of these terraces are also abandoned. They're not being cultivated at the moment. And then contrast that in the upper left-hand corner with agriculture, that you're looking at a cassava field, which is the staple vegetable, which you see all over the place, which is the other major form of the takeoff from the terraces. The lower left, you're looking at some primary forest. This picture was taken at about 520 meters, one of the highest elevation transects that I surveyed. And then this is a very obvious developed tract. Developed land also included lands where there were businesses on it and known homes or other tourist spots. So I performed 60 surveys across 28 different transect plots. I did my absolute best to highlight every part of the island. It's really difficult because the only good road is on the northern side, and the infrastructure is atrocious at the best of times. So getting over to this side of the island, where this is all largely cliffs, and doing that because I surveyed in AM and PM and nearly every transect. That means I was leaving in the dark, going across an island where they don't really use signs, and trying to make my way. So I did not survey as much of the southern side of the island as I would have liked, but did get a decent, I think a decent representation of the different areas, land uses, and elevations. So my equipment for the bird surveys was very high tech. Yeah, I had the camera with me just in case, but I did not use it 98% of the time because I had my binoculars in my hand and I was looking at everything I possibly could. And that was how I was able to do a lot of the species distinctions. And I also had one of the women from the Friends of the National Park Foundation with me in the forest and for like my first week to orient me, to help me with some of of the IDs. My tape measure to mark off the transects, flagging so I could return, because like I said, I was trying to do AM and PM repeats because that is when the bird activity is most prevalent. And then I had my triathlon watch because that served as my GPS. That way I knew exactly where I was and as I was walking my transect when I had reached the appropriate length. And this is exactly what that looks like. And I learned right away in the first picture on the left that I shouldn't be taking these pictures at dawn because they look weird and flashy. I would drop the tape measure, I would throw a flag down. I also learned that I should probably find a tree or something that's easy to mark. And then I would mark off the 30 meters, find the midway, and do my absolute best to stay in a straight line for 250 meters without falling on my face, which I did several times. It's also very, very dry. I did everything I could to not disrupt the birds. That way I was able to get as accurate a count as possible. So of the 60 species that I did see across the island, I saw 14 that are considered endemic to the greater region. That's why looking at the geography at the beginning is very important, because you see that Java is a stone's throw from Bali. So endemic to the region is including the western parts of those surrounding islands as well. I highlighted the two birds on the left, though they're of least concern. The Javan myna and the lemon-bellied white-eye were birds that I also saw just driving around the island. I'd see them all the time in cages. They're very popular. They're very popular house birds. The elegant pita outside of the Bali starling was one of the more beautiful birds that I saw in the surveys. And I wanted to highlight these little lanchura, the munias that are the little finch cousins, because they're flocking birds and they do some really interesting things to the numbers. Now some actual numbers. I used avibase.org as a resource to make the distinctions. That way it wasn't just an arbitrary, oh, this is local, this isn't. They had 430 birds documented on the greater Bali region. I only saw 60 of them, but this was not a comprehensive study. As you saw, I did not scour every inch of the island. It was just to give a baseline of the biodiversity. And of the 3,500 birds that I saw total though, this little guy, the city-headed bulbul, was nearly ubiquitous in every single transect. He's about 25% of that grand total. My big N is just this guy. Why? Because he does really well with humans. It also does really well attacking the fruit. That there's a lot of invasive fruit like papaya floating around and bananas that are just left fallow, and they thrive in that situation, where birds like the Bali myna don't. They primarily have an insect diet. And if you're coming in, you're wiping out the land, then their food source is going to disappear, and the bird is going to have a harder time living as well. And I pointed out the lanchura because though that list of endemic species came up to about 20% of the grand total, because they're flocking birds and they're primarily found in groups of like 50 or 100, if I deduct just those two species, then the rest of those birds that are considered endemic to that greater Bali region account for less than 5% of the total 3,500 birds that I saw. So I wanted to look at the different land uses, comparing them directly with the species that I found. In the blue line, you're actually looking at a species number comparison between the different land groups, like at the top, land use groups. At the top, you're looking at terraced and agriculture, and then developed and agriculture off to the right. And then the orange is the actual Jacquard coefficient, which is a percentage of the species that you're going to find among those two compared to the total number of species if you just added them up between the group. And it is completely logical that the terrace and agriculture had the highest Jacquard coefficient because they are essentially the same type of land. One is just actually being farmed. So looking at a little bit deeper, I looked at biodiversity indices across all of the different land uses, and did not find any significant differences in both the Shannon and the Simpson. But taking parts of that, I looked at evenness and density as well. Evenness, the trend started to go the other way. But then looking at the density, you see that there's a very significant difference in the forest, which is extremely counterintuitive. Like if you guys walked outside here, you're thinking like comparing what you're going to see in downtown area versus what you're going to see in Presque and the forest area, you think you're going to see more species, more birds, more density.
And that's really not the case here, because what is left of the forest is at these high elevations where everything's exposed. And if you're a bird that's only about a foot tall and weigh 4 or 5 pounds, you're not going to want to be whipped in an Indonesian wind in the middle of the summer. So what they have remaining, because of these land use changes, it's really limiting where they're able to live. So what am I taking away from this? Is that you have the whole counterintuitive situation with the forest, which is really not beneficial when you're looking at protecting species, particularly birds that are living in the forest. And with that, as humans are coming in and they're changing the face of the landscape even more in a different direction, it's going to make life more palatable for invasive species. And conservation is kind of like a diet. It sounds really good at the beginning. You go out, the first few weeks are solid. You're cutting the donuts, all that good stuff. They started out with the Bali myna. They were tagging the birds, they were following them, they were providing water, secondary homes for them. That was 2004, 2005. And now here we are in 2017, and none of that's being done at all. I talked to every person that I could that was involved with this in the NGOs and on the island. I saw 11 Bali myna total, and they estimated that there might be twice that number living total on the island. Not a happy story. But and this archipelago really can serve as a template, because we see, you know, all in tropical regions, be it islands or rainforests and whatnot, when you're deforesting or you're turning something into monoculture, you're wiping out everything that's living there. And this island has been kind of in a recovery phase for the last 100 years. And we're seeing that you really can't just flip that switch and say, okay, we're gonna turn this into a reserve and the animals are gonna be great and everything's gonna be hunky-dory. So with that, I just wanna thank really quickly the folks at the Friends of the National Park Foundation in Bali, my thesis committee, and the fine folks who have been funding my research at the Making a Difference Endowment and the NSF. So if you guys have any questions.
Are there migrant birds that would have been missing maybe in the Indonesian summer that go to temperate zones, like over in this side of the world?
There are a lot of migrant birds year round.
Yeah.
So there are different populations, and that's why I'm kind of like explicit in the fact that it's not comprehensive, you know. And you'd also need somebody, because on the shoreline, that's your bird composition is so completely different from, you know, north and south. So it's not going to be a significant population though. A lot of them, because size, you know, these guys are small, but they're not going crazy.
Was this a one-time study where you went out to the site, and if not, how did you get it?
Oh, this summer? Yeah, this was just this summer, and yeah, I flew into Bali, and then I had to get a boat over to the little island, and then I had to like charter locals to take me to the other little islands. So
The logistics was important.
yes.
So it sounds like the Bali myna has gone through this kind of really large population soon, right? So is anyone or do you have any thoughts about how that affects the genetic diversity of the population?
Oh yeah, actually, it's in the toilet. No, there are legitimate like genetic conservation. Like in Chicago, I know that at the Lincoln Zoo there, they have a captive population of the myna, and they're monitoring the genetics. But I mean, if you've only got, of the 11 I saw, 4 were adults. That gene pool is small. You know, and it might last for a little while, but you're not going to be able to, you know, that's not natural selection is going to play a really big role really quickly.
How long do they live? Like, if you have an adult, like, are any of those adults remaining from when they introduced them?
Okay, actual like captive lifespan versus what they could potentially do are two very different things. But
so in the wild.
Yeah, in the wild here, their lifespan is really short, largely because they're, what they're estimating, less than 5 years, because the dry seasons on these islands are becoming worse and worse. So not only are their food sources being depleted, but then when they just need, you know, basic things like water, and they're trying to compete with these guys who do really well with fruit, they're kind of getting the short end of the stick.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and so if you want to follow up and ask Ashley more questions, you can do so, but thank you very much.